It is 3 in the morning, somewhere in the North Atlantic, and the air has dropped well below freezing while nobody was watching a thermometer, because there was no thermometer, only skin that had already stopped feeling its own fingers, and breath that turned to pale steam the moment it left a man's mouth. A hammock swings inches from the next one, close enough that one man can feel his neighbor breathing through the dark. The shirt on his back has not been fully dry for 9 days straight, and the salt worked into the fabric scrapes his skin raw with every small movement. Every plank around him is soaked in tar and pitch, and every barrel stored below is packed with black powder that can turn one careless spark into a funeral for the entire crew. And on this ship, built from the most flammable materials of its century, the one comfort a freezing man wants most is the one thing he is forbidden to have, which is fire. Tonight, you live through one night on a pirate ship, and by the end of it, you will understand why 4 hours of sleep, taken in the cold and the wet and the dark, broke more men than any storm the ocean ever threw at them. The pirate ship never truly slept, because the ship itself could not afford to. Sailing a wooden vessel across open water meant someone had to be awake at every hour of the night, reading the wind, watching the horizon, and holding the wheel steady while the rest of the crew tried to rest. So the men were divided into watches, and the pattern used aboard both naval and pirate vessels of the period split the day into blocks of 4 hours each, with sailors rotating between labor and rest around the clock. A man might stand his watch from midnight until 4 in the morning, climb into a hammock still warm from the body that had just left it, and be shaken awake again barely a moment after his eyes had closed. Historical records confirm that this watch and watch pattern was standard practice across merchant, naval, and pirate crews alike, since the physics of moving a ship through open water simply did not allow for one long uninterrupted night of sleep for everyone at once. On some vessels, the afternoon hours were split into 2 shorter watches rather than one long one, a small mercy meant to stop the same unlucky sailors from being trapped on the worst overnight shift every single night in a row. Though the relief this offered was modest at best. The ship's bell governed every minute of the schedule, ringing out the half hours with total indifference to how exhausted a man felt. And that bell, not any single officer standing over him, was the true tyrant of shipboard life. What this pattern produced over the course of weeks and months at sea was not simple tiredness, but a debt of exhaustion that never fully cleared, one that accumulated night after night, until a man's hands moved slower on the ropes, his balance grew less certain on a rolling deck, and his temper grew shorter with the very crewmates he depended on to keep him alive. This is not the picture most people carry from film and legend, where a pirate captain and crew drink and celebrate through the night before sleeping off the excess whenever they please. The genuine record points somewhere far less romantic, toward a schedule closer to industrial shift work than to any life of leisure. A routine stricter in some ways than confinement on land, because a cell at least holds still, while a ship never stops rolling and pitching beneath the men trying to close their eyes inside it. On a pirate vessel, unlike a warship crowded with commissioned officers, it was very often the quartermaster rather than the captain who oversaw the daily grind of watches, rations, and discipline, a role that historians studying the Golden Age of Piracy describe as carrying real day-to-day authority over the crew. The quartermaster decided who stood which watch, settled disputes when 2 exhausted men clashed over a bruised elbow or a stolen blanket, and answered directly to the crew rather than to the captain alone, since many pirate companies operated under written articles that limited a captain's power outside of open battle. A storm at night made the whole rotation worse rather than better, because a squall did not wait politely for the next scheduled watch to begin, and men already worn down from a short broken sleep would be hauled from their hammocks early to fight canvas and rope and freezing spray, then sent back down soaked through, only to be woken again a few hours later when their turn came around once more. The place where all of this broken, rationed sleep actually happened turned out to be nearly as punishing as the schedule that forced it. Below the top deck, in a space with barely enough headroom for a man to stand fully upright, rows of canvas hammocks hung shoulder to shoulder from wooden beams, strung so close together that one sailor's elbow could brush against the man sleeping beside him without either of them shifting an inch. Hammocks became common aboard European ships after sailors encountered the design used by indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and crews adopted the idea quickly because a swinging bed absorbs the roll of a ship far better than any fixed wooden bunk, letting a man stay roughly level even as the deck beneath him tilts and drops with every wave. The advantage in stability, however, came paired with a near total loss of privacy, since dozens of men crowded onto one low deck meant a constant hum of breathing, coughing, and creaking canvas that never fully faded, even in the deepest hours of the night. The lower deck itself was a hostile environment in its own right, damp with condensation that gathered on the beams overhead and dripped steadily onto the men below, alive with the scratch and scurry of rats moving along the same wooden ribs the hammocks were tied to, and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, packed too closely together for too many weeks running. Clothing rarely had the chance to dry all the way through, because a man soaked by rain or sea spray during his watch would often climb straight into his hammock still damp, and salt worked its way permanently into the fabric, until every garment aboard grew stiff and abrasive against raw skin. According to accounts left behind by sailors of the period, this dampness was treated less as a hardship worth naming, and more as simply the unspoken price of a life at sea. An assumption woven so deeply into shipboard culture that basic comfort had almost become a foreign concept to men who had spent years afloat. Sleep itself, under these conditions, was never a private or restorative act the way it might be on land. It was closer to a shared, cramped, half-conscious truce among dozens of exhausted strangers who happened to share the same low, dripping ceiling. Almost nobody undressed to sleep. Pulling off a wet shirt meant losing what little trapped warmth a man had built up inside it, and a sailor roused for an unscheduled watch needed to be on deck within moments, not fumbling with buttons in the dark. Relieving oneself at night carried its own small ordeal, since the designated spot for it sat exposed at the very front of the ship, open to wind and spray, and a man half asleep making that walk in a rolling sea risked being swept overboard for the sake of a few seconds of business, which is part of why many crews kept a simple bucket below decks for use after dark, rather than risk the walk at all. None of this made it into the popular image of pirate life, yet these were the small, unglamorous decisions that shaped every single night at sea far more than any sword fight ever did. Every morning, before the deck woke fully into its daily routine, hammocks were untied, rolled tight, and lashed into neat bundles, then stowed along the rails rather than left hanging through the day, since a low deck cluttered with idle canvas would have gotten in the way of every task the crew needed to perform. On ships of the period, these tightly bound hammock rolls served a second, more brutal purpose beyond simple storage, since a wall of tightly packed canvas bundles could actually help absorb and slow small arms fire during a close engagement, turning a man's own bed into a crude piece of cover in a fight he never wanted to have. During heavy weather, sleeping in a swinging hammock became its own particular skill, since a violent enough roll could tip a sleeping man clean onto the deck below, and experienced sailors learned to wedge an arm or a leg against the canvas edge without ever fully waking, a habit built entirely out of repetition and necessity rather than comfort. Even inside this crowded, damp, rat-haunted deck, one single rule stood above every other rule aboard the ship, and breaking it could cost a man his life faster than any storm or any enemy sail on the horizon. Wood, tar, rope, canvas, and stored gunpowder together turned every wooden sailing ship of the era into something close to a floating store of fuel, and any open flame near that combination was treated not as a minor inconvenience, but as an existential threat to everyone aboard. For that reason, fire was tightly restricted to one single location, the galley, where the ship's cook prepared food inside an iron-lined firebox built specifically to contain sparks, and only during fixed hours rather than whenever a hungry or freezing sailor happened to want warmth. Outside of those approved hours, a lit candle or an open flame below decks was treated as one of the gravest offenses a man could commit, because a single stray spark drifting near a stored barrel of powder could end the ship and every life aboard it within seconds. So how did a crew survive the brutal cold of a North Atlantic night without so much as a lantern flame to warm frozen hands? Mostly, men endured it through their own bodies, packing close together inside the hammocks and huddling on deck during brief breaks, sharing warmth the same crude way any group of cold animals might in the wild. Constant movement helped as well, since sailors kept working through their watches rather than standing idle, and the physical labor of hauling rope and adjusting sail generated at least some heat even in freezing air. Rum played its own part in this ritual of survival, though its warmth was more illusion than fact, since alcohol widens the blood vessels near the surface of the skin and produces a fleeting sensation of heat, while the body underneath actually loses warmth faster than before, a truth that sailors of the period likely understood through hard experience rather than any written explanation. The galley fire itself became something close to sacred during its permitted hours, a single small orange glow in an otherwise cold and colorless world, drawing men toward it the same way any freezing creature drifts toward the nearest source of light and heat. The written code kept aboard one of the most notorious pirate crews of the Golden Age, later recorded by the chronicler Captain Charles Johnson, specified that all candles and lanterns aboard were to be put out by 8 in the evening, and that any man who wished to keep drinking after that hour was required to do so out in the open air of the deck, rather than below among the powder and the tar. Johnson's account remains one of the richest surviving sources on pirate life of the period, though historians treat it as valuable rather than beyond question, since parts of his work blend documented record with second-hand report. Even with that caution in mind, a rule this specific, written down and agreed to by the whole crew rather than simply ordered by a captain, tells its own quiet story about how seriously fire was treated aboard a pirate ship, since men willing to risk hanging for robbery on the high seas were not willing to risk their own vessel burning out from under them for the sake of a little extra light. But surviving the physical cold, brutal as it was, turned out to be only half the battle a pirate crew fought every single night, because what exhaustion did to the mind proved just as dangerous as what the cold did to the body. A crew running on 4 broken hours of sleep, night after night, for months at a stretch, does not simply feel tired. It begins to make the kind of mistakes that cost lives. A lookout who has not slept properly in days can stare directly at a line of rocks or a hostile sail on the horizon and fail to register the danger in time to act. And the age of sail is filled with recorded cases of exhausted crews running their own vessels aground through simple failures of attention that a rested man would very likely have caught. When a man did not survive the cold, or a fall from the rigging, or an accident brought on by exhaustion, there was no port to carry him to and no ground to dig. His body was sewn into his own hammock canvas, weighted with a cannonball or a length of chain at the feet, and given over to the water after a short reading, often within hours of his death, since a ship at sea in warm or cold climates alike had no way to preserve a corpse for long. Chronic sleep deprivation carries well-documented effects on judgment, patience, and impulse control. So it is worth asking what a crew worn down for months on end might have been more willing to risk. Some historians who study pirate mutinies list grinding fatigue as one plausible contributing factor among several, though this remains an interpretation drawn from the general pattern of shipboard life, rather than a cause proven in any single surviving case, and it should be treated as an educated reading of the evidence rather than settled fact. A related idea appears from time to time in the same research: the suggestion that grueling work schedules aboard vessels of every flag, not pirate ships alone, may have served the side effect of leaving restless men too exhausted to organize against their officers. Though again, this functions as a theory about the effects of fatigue, rather than proof that any captain deliberately engineered his schedule for that purpose. This stands in sharp contrast to the popular image of piracy as a life of loose discipline and endless leisure between raids, an image built almost entirely by film rather than by any surviving ship's log or court record. In reality, a pirate's sleep was rationed, monitored, and shaped by forces almost entirely outside his own control, whether that force was the ship's bell, the weather, or the simple physical limits of a worn-out body. Historical fact versus popular myth stands especially clear on this point, since the swaggering, well-rested pirate of the screen bears little resemblance to the hollow-eyed, chronically sleep-starved sailor described in surviving accounts of shipboard life. Once you see how tightly a pirate's rest was controlled by forces bigger than himself, a strange question starts to surface, one that has nothing to do with treasure or cannon fire at all. Sailors serving aboard a king's warship of the same period endured nearly identical hardships, the same 4-hour watches, the same crowded hammocks, the same damp uniforms that never fully dried between storms. Yet a pirate crew chose this life, while a naval crew was very often forced into it through impressment or plain economic desperation, with no real say in the matter at all. The difference between these two lives was never comfort, because comfort barely existed aboard either kind of vessel in any meaningful sense. The real difference lives somewhere else entirely, in the fact that a pirate crew voted on decisions that touched their own fate and shared directly in whatever plunder the voyage produced, while a common sailor in a king's navy received a fixed and often delayed wage, regardless of how much wealth his labor helped bring home, to men who would never once set foot on a rolling deck. Written pirate articles from the period commonly guaranteed every man a voice in major decisions and a share of the takings set out in advance, a level of say over one's own working life that a pressed naval sailor of the same era could barely have hoped for. Stripped down to its simplest form, this becomes a story about how far a human being will stretch his own body and mind when he believes the suffering serves a choice he made for himself rather than an order handed down from someone he never chose to follow. Somewhere tonight, most people will fall asleep warm, dry, and still, in a bed that does not swing and air that does not turn their breath to pale steam, wrapped in a version of comfort that a pirate crew could barely have pictured as real. That freezing man from the opening of this film, the one whose fingers had gone numb in a hammock strung inches from the next, made his choice anyway, hour after broken hour, because the alternative on land offered him no vote, no share, and no voice at all. It is worth asking honestly, without any easy or comfortable answer, how many hours of warmth and stillness a person might be willing to trade away in exchange for a genuine voice in the course of his own life. History never quite settles that question, and it was probably never meant to.